Hook, she left a shaky note on the coffee shop receipt, 3 words written in a hurried hand, "Meet me before I die." I read it twice, then folded the greasy slip into my palm like a compass pointing toward someone else's last chance. For a moment I thought it was a joke, a line from a movie, a dare left behind by a stranger who wanted to see if anyone would care. Then I looked up at the girl by the window, her sleeve stained with paint, a bruise like a half-moon on her wrist, and I knew the joke was over. If you stay with me, I promise you'll watch 2 people learn that what we call courage sometimes arrives late, that the smallest acts can change the map of someone's life, and that meeting someone, before they die, can mean more than one kind of ending. The café smelled like rain and cinnamon. It was the kind of place where people came to hide from their appointments and invent quieter versions of themselves. I'd been there every Tuesday for a year, the same table by the window, the same black mug, the same unread paper half folded and waiting. Routine was a shelter after my divorce, a small, reliable shore to return to when my calendar felt like an accusation. She walked in on a Tuesday that happened to be unusually loud, laughter from a table of college students, the hiss of the espresso machine, a barista swearing softly at a grinder. She wasn't young in the fresh, theatrical way, she had an economy of movement that suggested long days and small worries. She ordered tea. Her voice, when she spoke to the barista, had the reserve of someone trying not to reveal where she was fragile. She sat at the corner table near me but not close enough to make conversation easy. I noticed the receipt because it slid from between the pages of a dog-eared notebook like a white moth that had forgotten to fly. The barista's pen had left a dark fleck of ink on the paper. Written across the top, in hurried capital letters, were those 3 words, "Meet me before I die." Underneath, a name, Layla. A time, 5 p.m. A scribbled number that had 1 digit smudged into a question mark. For a long time I did nothing. There is a cowardice that dresses itself up as common sense. "Don't interfere, mind your own business, she asked for privacy by coming here alone." I told myself those things, and I almost believed them. But there was something in the way she drew her cardigan tighter around her shoulders that made me feel like time had just put a hand on her back and said, "Hurry." I folded the receipt into my pocket like contraband and watched her through the steam of my mug. At 4:45 she left the café with her notebook under her arm and a guarded tilt to her chin, as if she were bargaining with the world for a peaceful afternoon. I followed, which sounds more dramatic when you say it aloud than it felt in the moment. An impulse, a small rebellion against my own inertia. She walked fast, not in the stride of someone anxious to be somewhere, but with the purposeful step of someone who had made a decision and was practicing it. I caught up at the riverbank, where the city thinned into trees and murmuring water. She was standing on a bench, the notebook face down, shoulders slightly bowed. I hovered for a breath, then said her name. It startled her as if I'd interrupted a conversation with grief. She didn't turn immediately. When she did, her eyes were careful, the way someone looks at a photograph of a house they used to live in. "You left this," I said, and unfolded the receipt like an offering. She let out a laugh that was almost a sob. "I did," she said. "I write absurd things when I can't sleep." "You meant it," I said. It was not a question. Her face rearranged itself into a map I wanted to read. "I meant the promise," she said. "Not the dying part necessarily." There was a brittle humor there, a defense that read like an edit in a book you didn't know how to close. There's a story in there about a misdiagnosis and hospital lights that hum like a lullaby. But really, Meet Me Before I Die it's about not letting the last moments be the only ones that matter. She told me her name, Layla, and how she painted murals for small businesses and taught art to children on Saturday mornings. She made a living coaxing colors into reluctant walls and mending other people's broken afternoons. She also told me, in fragments, about the diagnosis that had shadowed her life for 2 years, a slow, insistent illness that had pulled teeth from her calendar and taught her how to count good days like beads. The doctors had said many things at different times: hope, watchful waiting, a list of options, and somewhere along the line she'd started to measure herself in appointments rather than in hours. I left the receipt as a dare to myself, she admitted. A way to see if strangers would agree to be witness. But then I panicked. If I actually met with someone who cared? That would be, she flung her hands, embarrassed at her own vulnerability. It would be too honest. Honesty is loud in a place without background music. We sat on the bench until the sun turned the river to polished copper, and I learned the shape of her laughter and the precise way she avoided answering questions about the future. She was not the kind of person who wanted pity, she wanted presence. She also had secrets, an estranged father she hadn't seen since childhood, a younger brother overseas she sent postcards to and then sometimes forgot to mail, and a love once so fierce it had taught her how to trust the wrong people. I told her my name and the small, safe version of my life, an ex-wife who left a room full of unwashed dishes and a son who lived with her every other weekend and a job that required me to be on time for other people's troubles. We traded the rhythms of ordinary people, and in doing so we began to stitch a fragile trust. She asked if I could help her with a list. It was not a bucket list of things like bungee jumping or kissing. A stranger at midnight. It was quieter and harder, reconcile with someone from her past, paint a mural she'd wanted to do for a community center, find a place to leave a letter for her brother in case she couldn't be the one to tell him everything. The list was modest in activities but enormous in emotional weight. Each item was a knot she couldn't untie alone. I told her I would help, partly because I had nothing better to refuse, partly because there is a small, luminous pleasure in being asked to matter in someone else's last chapters. We agreed to meet again the next day, to begin untying knots. The first challenge was to locate her father. He lived in a neighborhood thick with memories and loose dogs, the kind of place where time piled in front yards like newspapers. Layla had a photo of him with her as a toddler, someone whose hands had been steady then, who now might not know how to hold the shape of regret. She wanted to talk, to speak the truth of old grievances, to listen to the life that had gone on without her. Her father's apartment smelled of boiled potatoes and old books. He opened the door as if expecting a delivery, a pensioner's polite distance, and when Layla stepped into the dim hallway his face crumpled like paper that had been folded and refolded for decades. He said his name and did not at first say hers. They sat, a triangular distance between them, the man who had drifted away, the woman who had learned to hang her life on the thin thread of the present, and me, a newcomer who felt suddenly intrusive and necessary. Reconciliation is not a thing that happens in scenes like in movies. It is messy, like trying to tune a radio in a storm. Layla's father had his reasons, drunken years, a failed business, a fear of closeness that hardened into absence. She had her wounds, nights spent hungry, a childhood calibration of expectations. They spoke in halting parables, in confessions that were almost about other people until they weren't. In the end what they managed was uneven, apologies that scratched the surface and promises that trembled like new paint. It was enough because sometimes, enough, is the bridge between the islands of regret. For the mural, Layla wanted color that didn't apologize, fierce blues and hopeful oranges and a phoenix that could be read as both a literal bird and a stubborn human insistence to start again. The community center was skeptical at first, budgets are picky and committees are made of people who prefer safe grays. But standing in the doorway, canvas in hand, paint on her fingers, a crowd of kids pressing their faces against glass, Layla found courage in the smallness of practice. She taught the children to mix paints like they were mixing possibility, she climbed a ladder and let her arm make wide, unapologetic strokes. The mural became a place other people could stand against their own walls and say, I was here. We checked off items on her list with the care of people tending a fragile garden. Each task did not cure the illness, it rearranged the furniture of her life so that there was space for more sunlight. We wrote the letter to her brother and left it with a neighbor who agreed to post it if anything happened to her. We organized a small showing of her canvases at a café that specialized in second chances. She called a therapist and kept the first appointment. Each thing was a stitch, imperfect but real. There were nights I would go home thinking I had done the right thing and then wake with an odd, panicked realization that my own grief had been shoved into a closet to make room for hers. Helping someone in crisis is not a pure noble act, it is messy and human and often reveals your own hungers. I was learning how to be useful and how to be honest with my limits. There was a point, halfway through our list, where I asked her why she had written, "Before I die," instead of something less dramatic. She looked at me for a long while, as if measuring whether I could hold the answer. "Because the truth feels louder when you give it a deadline," she said finally. "Because I wanted people to take me seriously. Because sometimes the phrase, 'before I die,' pulls the world forward. And because I was afraid someone would forget to ask me to stay." We had nearly finished the list when the hospital called. A new scan had shown progression, subtle, merciless. Layla breathed through it with an odd kind of clarity, as if the news had sharpened the outline of what mattered. The doctors gave options, some of them clumsy with hope. Layla chose to continue painting and to spend her energy on people and places that made her laugh. To choose joy in the face of decline is not naive, it is an act of fierce rebellion. The next weeks were a collage of visits. The clinic, Layla's small studio where the floor was always dusted with pigment, a rooftop where she and I and a few friends she had allowed in sat and shared hot, stolen pastries. We talked about what it meant to be brave. Once, under a sky that smelled like trash and rain and possibility, she said, "I don't want to die quietly. I want to leave crumbs, small things people can follow back to me and say, 'She was here.'" I learned things about her I hadn't known before. She had a laugh that could make strangers stop and look. When she was 12 she had taught herself to ride a bike on the first street she ever lived on. She had once saved a stray cat who changed the pattern of her nights. These details mattered because they were the luminous stitches of a person who refused to be reduced to a diagnosis. There was a man named Tariq who arrived late in the story, with an olive complexion and a nervous laugh. He worked at the community center and had been a quiet admirer of Layla's murals from the start. He brought her tea and books on painters she had never heard of. He did not say anything heroic, he simply showed up, which is often enough. Tariq had his own inventory of hurts, but in his presence Layla found ease. What developed between them was not an immediate, cinematic romance, those are rare and often made of fantasy. Instead, it was the slow easing of two people who learned each other's small preferences, how Layla liked her tea with a wedge of lemon, how Tariq hummed when he painted, how both of them hated cilantro. The toughest test came on a rainy afternoon when I accompanied Layla to a small hospice she'd been told about, just in case. The rooms there smelled of antiseptic and lavender. It felt obscene to call it comforting, but there was a quiet dignity in people being tended with ordinary tenderness. Layla refused to be pitied. She asked for the hospice room to be filled with art supplies and an old radio that played songs she loved. She insisted on making plans, funeral music, a playlist of songs that made her dance in the kitchen, a note to be read to her brother if she fell asleep and did not wake up. The night she fell worse, the city was starless and the rain had the patience of someone who has no plans to leave soon. Her breathing became an instrument I understood the notes of, and the nurses moved like careful shadows. Tariq came and sat without speaking, his hand folded around hers. Her father came too, smaller now, his voice softer. The brother, by a miracle of distance and desire, got the letter and flew in. The room filled with people who loved her, stitched together by this one fragile life. She called me to the bedside and took my hand with the strength of someone who knew how to be brave even when the body is tired. "You remember the receipt?" she asked, and for a second I imagined being 12 years old and very frightened and wanting to hide some truth inside a joke. "I do," I said. "You did what you promised. You showed up," she said. There was no dramatic last speech, no revelation that rewrote our lives. There was gratitude and a small laughter that tasted like sun on pavement. She told us about small things she wished for after, about a reading she wanted at the community center, about a mural to be finished and hung, about a garden where her brother could plant something that might outlive him. Those were ordinary, human wishes, they felt like secrets we had been granted. When she asked me to read the first letter she had ever written to her brother aloud, I did. My voice cracked, of course. The room listened. Sometimes watching a hand move slowly across paper is the truest kind of seeing. She didn't die that night. She didn't die the next morning either. The days blurred into a slow, careful reverie of small mercies, a good cup of tea, a short walk to the sun at the hospice garden, a phone call with her brother in which they laughed at old jokes and promised to send photos of mundane things. The illness took as it does, with greedy patience, but it did not steal the moments of grace she had arranged for herself. In the weeks that followed, something shifted in me that I hadn't anticipated. I had come to be a helper because the task demanded it, because it made me feel like a man who could be useful. But I found myself changed into someone who now measured his days by other scales. I laughed more freely. I called my son every other night instead of every other weekend. I learned that showing up for someone else had taught me to show up for myself. There were setbacks, scans that reminded us of the body's treachery, nights when Layla would retreat into a silence like ice. Once, in the quiet between midnight and dawn, she whispered a fear that she hadn't told anyone, that she was terrified of being forgotten. Not forgotten as in erased, she said, but forgotten as in people moving on without the small habits I made them keep. I told her it was impossible to be forgotten by those who had loved her, and then I told her the truth I had come to understand: people remember what matters to them. We keep what we choose. She smiled, that little light returning to the corner of her mouth, and painted a tiny phoenix on my wrist with a borrowed pen as a joke and a charm. Spring folded into summer. The mural was finished and public. Kids traced the bird's wings with their hands and took pictures that would outlive them. Layla's father came often, his presence steady but shy. Tariq read with her at the community center, her favorite books laid out on a table like small islands of joy. Her brother sent a patchwork of photographs. She signed the order to donate some of her canvases to the center. She wanted younger artists to have a place to hang their first, uncertain work. I don't know if my telling you this feels too tidy, because real life resists tidy endings. Layla's illness progressed and retreated like a tide you learn to build your life around. There was no miraculous recovery and no cinematic, heart-stopping farewell. There were, instead, long afternoons where people came and stayed, where stories were told again and again until their edges softened. There were moments of unbearable sadness and moments that shone with radiant smallness, the way she would hum when she cooked, the way she designed a mural from memory and then laughed when a child wanted to add a scribbled dinosaur to it. One evening, months after the receipt had landed like an accusation in my pocket, Layla took my hand in the small garden behind the hospice. Fireflies made the air glitter. Her breath came shorter than it used to, but her eyes were fierce. She looked at me and said, "You promised to meet me before I die. You kept your promise." "Did you?" She hesitated. "Did you learn anything?" I had to think. There is a pressure in those questions, as if one life might be a mirror that shows a truth to another. I learned that people are heavier than they look and more like paper cranes. Folded and refold and somehow capable of flight, I said. It was utter nonsense and also the only truth I had. I learned that not being alone is a kind of miracle. I learned that people are heavier than they look and more like paper cranes, folded and refold and somehow capable of flight, I said. It was utter nonsense and also the only truth I had. I learned that not being alone is a kind of miracle. I learned that promises are not contracts but breaths we share. She laughed, small and pleased, and then the laugh became a cough. We watched the sky change color. She reached up and traced a line along the phoenix tattoo, my wrist where I had painted it months ago with her pen when we were still practicing courage. "Leave crumbs," she whispered, quoting herself, and then she closed her eyes. When the end came, it did so with a tenderness that felt like an offering. People gathered, some who had been on the list, some who had not. There was music, small, imperfect songs, there were paintings hung on the hospice walls, there were stories, raw and beautiful. Her brother read a letter he had planned to read aloud and then couldn't, and Tariq read it for him. Her father held a photograph like it was a relic. The mural's image, vivid and loud, hung on a screen at the back of the room, and children looked at it and understood something of the shape of courage without needing to be taught. The thing I took from all of it is not that death taught me how to live, that's a cliché I always hated, but that small axe ripple. A receipt on a table, a promise kept between two people who had only just met, a mural that became a meeting place, these were not grand gestures, but they were the architecture of a life that mattered. In the months after, people would come to the community center and tell stories about Layla and how she changed them. The children would point at the phoenix and say, "That bird was painted by someone who laughed real loud." That is the memory that stayed, the ordinary ways she insisted on being bright. There's a final, quiet thing I should tell you. After she died, I found a scrap of paper folded into the spine of one of her sketchbooks. On it she had written, in the same hurried capitals that had frightened me on the receipt, a short list: 1. Paint. 2. Love. 3. Be brave enough to ask for help. Beneath it, in smaller letters, she'd added, and meet people before you die, because sometimes they will teach you how to keep living. If you stayed with me to the end, thank you. Promise me one small, human thing: if you ever find a receipt with a line that seems too dramatic for the paper it's printed on, don't fold it into your pocket and forget it. Bring it to light. Meet the person who left it. Because the world will ask little favors of us: come to a mural, listen to a story, hold a hand, and the small acts are the ones that change the direction of the wind. Layla's mural still stands. Children still press their palms against the painted wing. People still bring cups of tea to the community center. I still sit at the same window table on Tuesdays, but now I leave my phone off and my heart open. Sometimes courage arrives as a receipt on a café table. Sometimes it arrives as a familiar face at a hospice garden. Mostly, it arrives when someone else decides that their life will be more ordinary and braver, messy and given away, like paint spread over a wall. If there's a final lesson here, it's simply this: we are allowed to ask for witnesses. And when someone asks you to meet them before they die, consider saying yes.